More Americans have fallen into poverty in the last few years during some of the worst economic times since the Great Depression. So, with more people living on the breadline, is the American dream endangered? You're watching Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. A large and growing number of Americans are poor. That's according to the latest census figures, which suggest 1 in 3 Americans are living in poverty, or what's sometimes called near poverty.
It's like the American dream in reverse.
And these numbers follow years of stagnating wages for the middle class. On taking office in 2009, President Obama described the state of the U.S. economy as, quote, a disaster for America's working families. As the U.S. begins a presidential election year, the economy and how to fix it is on the minds of most voters. But taxation and spending policies are the subject of frequent bitter partisan divide in Washington. And a few months ago, the Occupy Wall Street movement began in New York and spread around the world. The protesters' slogan, "We are the 99%, refers to the growing income and wealth inequality in the U.S. between the wealthiest 1% and the rest of the population. More than 13 million Americans are unemployed, though there has been some improvements recently. Many others are in work, but have been forced to take pay cuts or take a reduction in working hours. Millions of homeowners have lost their homes through the process known as foreclosure, where the bank repossesses their property. And at the same time, the budget cuts at federal and state level are eroding some of the government's social welfare programs. So how can prosperity be restored for the American population, and should Americans reassess the meaning of the American dream? To discuss all this and more, we're joined by Cornel West, a philosopher, activist and professor at Princeton University. We also have Tavis Smiley, a chat show host on PBS. They've both written an upcoming book called The Rich and the Rest of Us, a Poverty Manifesto. Also in the studio is Barbara Ehrenreich, a columnist and author of Nickel and Dimed on Not Getting By in America. Welcome to all of you to the show.
Thank you.
Tavis Smiley, let me start with you. You've taken a leading role in highlighting the problem of poverty in the United States. In fact, you've convened a conference here in Washington, which is called Remaking America from Poverty to Prosperity. I want to talk about that in more detail in just a moment. But first, let's take a closer look at the number of Americans faced with poverty. Now, more than 46 million Americans are living below the poverty line, according to the latest figures in 2010. That's more than 15% of the population. More than 1 in 5 children are living in poverty. Minorities have been disproportionately affected. More than 27% of African Americans are poor, while more than 26% of Hispanics fall below the poverty line. Now, Tavis, as we know that the United States went through an economic downturn from 2007 to 2009, you commissioned a study on the impact that downturn has had on poverty levels and on unemployment with Indiana University. What did that study tell you?
I'm happy to answer that. Let me first start by saying how delighted I am to be on Al Jazeera, sitting alongside these two most progressive voices in the American culture when it comes to these kinds of issues. This white paper that we commissioned finds that the Great Recession has had a damning and traumatic impact on the average American. For example, there are more Americans now than at any point in the history of this country who have been stuck in long-term unemployment. The report finds that the younger you are, the more likely you are to be in poverty. The report finds that even when we start to see an uptick in our economy, when the economy starts to come back, the numbers of the poor are still going to grow, primarily because the pace of the recovery is so slow, because additionally you've had so many long-term unemployed, and thirdly, the unemployment number still remains too high in this country across the board. So the bottom line is that we have got to get a conversation in this country about the poor. Let me add right quick. In the last election, 2008, in those 3 presidential debates between Mr. McCain and Mr. Obama, the word poor, the word poverty does not come up one time. Obama doesn't raise it, McCain doesn't raise it, the moderators don't ask a single question about poverty. Fast forward 4 years, 1 out of 2 Americans is either in or near poverty. We cannot abide another race for the White House where the issue of poverty does not get pushed up higher on the American agenda.
Barbara Ehrenreich, there's a headline in the Washington Post which you brought to our attention, talking in part about what Tavis Smiley has just said, and that headline says household wealth down in the 3rd quarter, and the subheading on that is corporate cash continues to grow. according to a federal report. I guess one could say that just encapsulates what the 1% and the 99% have been telling us.
Well, yes, and I think this is something that's going to come out in the book that you're going to, The Rich and the Rest of Us soon, that we've been really seeing an upward redistribution of wealth in this country. Going back before the recession, you know, through so many ways, you know, grinding people down, working people down with very low wages, and then making money off of them through credit schemes and, you know, dodging mortgages and so on. But it's all been an upward redistribution, and that's where the, you know, I think that's why the energy for the Occupy movement is people saying, wait a minute, look what we've produced. This tiny bunch of super wealthy people who have really moved off into the stratosphere. They fly in their own planes. They really have they don't have to interact with the rest of us in any way. And this has got to be stopped.
Professor West, Tavis Smiley makes a great point there that in the last election campaign, neither candidate Obama at the time or John McCain mentioned the word poverty or poor. Why is there such reluctance? And we still find that to this day. There is reluctance among the ruling class, especially in Congress, to A, acknowledge that poverty is a problem, and B, to do something about it.
I think part of the problem is that in the United States you have two dominant parties. One party is a conservative version of the rule of oligarchs. That's the Republican Party. It's very cold-hearted, mean-spirited, and usually highly mendacious and mediocre. Then you've got the Democratic Party, which is a neoliberal version of the rule of oligarchs, which tends to engage in more populist rhetoric, but are still tied to big business, tied to big corporations and big money that just overwhelms the political system and corrupts it and poisons it in so many ways. And so what happens? Well, the legacies of Martin Luther King Jr. and Dorothy Day, the kind of work you get in the classic like Nickel and Dime by Barbara Ehrenreich, the kind of work that Brother Tavis is doing. The voice of poor and working people left out. There's no party, there's no institution, there's no expression of the plight of poor and working people, and that's precisely what the three of us attempt to do. And it's very difficult to do that in the United States because those two dominant parties tend to suck a lot of the oxygen out of the political room.
But you would agree, though, Doc, though, that there is at the moment, though, and I think, a bipartisan consensus.
Yes.
Doc lays out very nicely the distinct differences between these two parties. At the moment, though, in Washington, there is a bipartisan consensus that the poor really don't matter. So that neither party has really stepped up with a real serious plan to not just reduce poverty, but to eradicate it.
Absolutely.
So in that regard, both parties are suspect, I think, on this issue.
Yeah, because most of the talk we hear about is how to move wealth even further to the top 1%, you know, tax breaks, movement of money to corporations, no regulatory mechanisms in place, remove all of them, etc. Barbara,
Just one other thing on this subject. It's not only the parties and the domination of wealth, but the words "the poor" becomes a code for black or people of color.
Right.
And so you see like Newt Gingrich, you know, saying I'd rather have black people get a paycheck than
great
food
point you
stamps.
mentioned there, because we have some tape of Newt Gingrich.
no,
Let's look at
we
this.
have to hear him?
This is the this is the Republican presidential candidate Newt Gingrich speaking against poverty assistance programs. Let's take a listen.
We will make the key test very simple. Food stamps versus paychecks. Obama is the best food stamp president in American history. More people are on food stamps today because of Obama's policies than ever in history. I'm prepared, if the NAACP invites me, I'll go to their convention and talk about why the African American community should demand paychecks and not be satisfied with food stamps.
Well, Barbara, there you go. Just makes your point there. Tavis, I'll come to you in a moment. Barbara, here's another thing. Have you found in your work that the system is actually stacked against people who are poor and unemployed? They don't get much help from the public sector.
Right,
in fact, they
yeah.
get victimized because if you're unemployed, you get harassed by the police, you get fined for petty crimes, you get a police record, makes it far difficult to get a job.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's sort of my theme. Maybe this is the age of diminished expectations, but don't think we're going to see great expansions in all the kinds of programs that we need that would solve the problem. But what we should be aware of is that right now, not only do we not as a society reach out a hand to people who are falling down, we kick them further. That is the policy. There is a policy, a poverty policy in this country, and that is to persecute them. And you mentioned a few things I would, Cornel, you were involved in the protests against stop and frisk. Now that has increased.
Absolutely.
Stop and frisk. Now that's directed at Black and Latino, working class people primarily. There's just it's everywhere. There was a report in the newspaper this weekend that in the New York City subways, you can now get arrested for putting your feet up on another seat, even if it's 3 a.m. and you're the only one in the car.
And a number of people have been arrested.
And you get a fine,
and you get a fine too.
And these fines, they're fines all over the country for your kids being truants from school.
That's
now,
right. That's right. I mean, I think
and all of these things just build up and build up and build up.
She's rightly talking about the ways in which poor people have not only been demonized, but poverty's criminalized. And so to be poor is not only to be devalued, but it's to be locked into criminal justice system. The United States has spent $300 billion since 1980 for jails, prisons, and the criminal justice system. That's a Marshall Plan. It's a penal, carceral Marshall Plan. Now, we've been calling for an urban Marshall Plan for jobs, education, housing, health care, so that the priorities are so warped in the United States that people would rather put money in the prisons than to really accent just how precious and how priceless poor people are, and it recognize that any human being must never be reduced to market price.
And if I can, just 30 seconds here, in terms of picking up on something that Barbara Ehrenreich said a moment ago, that's important not get lost in this conversation. What she suggested, and she's right, and Dr. West echoes, is that poverty in this country right now is color-coded. Poverty is color-coded, and the danger with that is it sends the wrong message about what's happening with regard to poverty in this country. The numbers of the poor are growing exponentially. The new poor in this country now are the former middle class. The reality is there are more white Americans in poverty than there are Black Americans in poverty in terms of sheer numbers. There are more white Americans in poverty than there are brown Americans in poverty, or red Americans, or yellow Americans. So when poverty gets color-coded, like the clip you played of Newt Gingrich, and you had your producers had a litter to choose from. They could have gotten the Gingrich clip, they could have gotten the Santorum clip, they could have gotten the Ron Paul clip, they could have gotten the Romney clip. They've all made these comments where they want to color-code poverty, but the reality is that Americans across the board, of every race, every ethnicity, every color, every creed, every gender, poverty is growing exponentially in this country. When 1 out of 2 Americans, again, is either in poverty or near poverty, that's not a Black problem, that's an American problem. And I hate when we have these conversations and people try to suggest that poverty is Black or poverty is brown. No, poverty is American, and we all as Americans have to push back on that.
Barbara, to what extent has the problem of poverty in, say, the last 2 decades been aggravated by the fact that money has been moving to the rich 1%? I mean, we also have to take account of the fact that the economy's been in a downturn. But how much has that added to poverty? The fact that, as Tavis says, the middle class has got smaller.
The middle classes, yeah. Well, I mean, there's this overall redistribution. Cut taxes for the rich and cut wages and social programs and anything for the middle class and the poor. That's been going on. But what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years of recession, is to underscore what Tavis just said, that we can't talk about poverty as some kind of fixed population. Downward mobility is very, very common in America. This is for people who, quote, play by the rules, do everything. You go through college, you get mass huge debts to get through college, and then there you are. You can be white in this situation too. You cannot get a job for, say, over $10 an hour. You cannot pay those debts.
Right.
And so the destruction of the middle class that we've seen very vividly in a speeded up way in the last few years, is very much part of the situation. So we're not talking about, those people. We're talking about something that really threatens all of us.
And now there's so many, I'm sorry, Doc, just very quick. There's so many American employers. The state of New Jersey has already made this illegal. I think Illinois is debating it now. but Barbara knows as well, that there are states, and there in this country, America, there are many major American corporations, multinationals. When they direct you an online to apply for the job, you find this disclaimer that says, do not apply if you are currently unemployed. So when you talk about demonizing the poor, you talk about unemployment, you talk about the increasing numbers of poverty, and then for persons who are doing everything they can of every color to find a job, they go online and then they're told if you're already unemployed, you need not apply. This is what we're talking about when we say that the poor are being demonized.
Right.
Or if you get a little further along the line, most firms now use a credit check to decide whether you should be hired. So that's to say, if you're somebody who's been having financial difficulty or unemployed or anything like that, we don't want you.
But I think the good news is, though, is that there's a democratic awakening taking place in America, deeply influenced by our brothers and sisters in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, in Bahrain, and other places, in Greece, in Italy. Unemployment rate in Italy is roughly the same as that in the United States, we forget. But the democratic awakening, the Occupy movement at the center, but there's other spin-offs. And what does that mean? It means it casts a limelight on the corporate greed. It casts a limelight on the rule of oligarchs. It casts a limelight on so many of working and poor people who have been sleepwalking, who have been afraid, fearful, not wanting to straighten their backs up and organize and mobilize. And it is a new day. And this is very important. And I think the world needs to know this, that in the middle of the American empire, with the arbitrary military power dropping those vicious bombs on innocent folk in Pakistan and Yemen, giving the arbitrary police power in poor communities, black and brown, working class pushed against the wall, that fight back is taking place. And it's a beautiful thing to be a part of, so that the voices that you hear now, which were once voices in the wilderness just a few years ago, are now moving very slowly toward the center. And so the legacies of Martin King and others come back with a tremendous presence, and it's a magnificent thing to be a part of.
Tavis, there is another phenomenon in the United States, and this is the phenomenon of the near poor. These are people who are living just above the poverty line. In your work, in the study that you commissioned, did you come across this, and how widespread is that?
The report from Indiana University really does lay that out quite clearly. As I think intimated earlier, we have the poor, the perennially poor, we have the new poor, and we have the near poor. You put all those numbers together, and you got the majority of Americans who are caught up in one of those categories. Dr. West and I took a poverty tour last summer around the country, got on a bus, went to 11 states, 18 cities over a number of days, and we talked to many of these persons who find themselves in one of these three categories. So yes, these numbers are extremely real. The problem is, again, that our leaders have not taken this issue seriously. I think Dr. West is right, though, that there is an awakening that's starting to happen here now. I was heartened, as I know others were, that even Time magazine got around to declaring that the protester was the person of the year for 2011.
That's right, yeah.
And so I think that, again, you're starting to see people starting to awake, to come out, as Dr. West said, of the sleepwalking. And I'm just hopeful that in this year, that with our voices and the voices of others like us, that poverty is going to get the attention that it deserves right about now.
Okay, well, let's take a listen to what President Obama has said about this. While announcing his plan for creating more jobs last year, he reiterated his call for the rich to pay more taxes. Let's watch.
While most people in this country struggle to make ends meet, a few of the most affluent citizens and most profitable corporations enjoy tax breaks and loopholes that nobody else gets. Right now, Warren Buffett pays a lower tax rate than his secretary, an outrage he has asked us to fix. We need a tax code where everyone gets a fair shake and where everybody pays their fair share.
Professor West, that sentiment that the president expresses there, why has it been so difficult for Americans to catch on to that?
Well, one is that it's just so isolated and it's so late that when Barack Obama took office, he brought in the favorites of Wall Street. He brought in Larry Summers. He brought in Tim Geithner. Tim Geithner is still running things. So that rhetoric and the wonderful language is populist, but it's technocratic on the ground because Tim Geithner is Wall Street's man. He's still running things. When you look at his new chief of staff, he's from Citigroup. That's tied to Bob Rubin and company. These are the very deregulators and free marketeers that pushed us to the brink. So you get a schizophrenic Barack Obama. You get populist gestures here and there, usually during election time. That's how neoliberals usually operate, right? But on the ground, it's very much tied to big business, tied to Wall Street, tied to oligarchic power and plutocratic power. And so in that sense, he's got to do much more to convince someone like myself that he's not just an extension of these oligarchs with a silver tongue.
Tavis, to what extent? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, just going to suggest that there's another factor, more of a psychological thing, is that we have been led to believe for a long time in this country that anybody can make it by either working hard or by visualizing success.
I want to stop you right there, because we have been talking to ordinary Americans on the street about the American dream, if that dream ever existed. Let's take a listen to what they've been saying.
Everybody, try to cross the border and come in this country because we have a dream, America's dreams. Yeah, I like that, but not anymore. It's not dreams over here, not good dreams.
As certain social problems have become more obvious, I think the American dream is worrying about health care for your kids and for your family, worrying about paying your mortgage and things like that are a little bit more subsistence and maybe a little less lofty.
There's too much difference between a public school in a rich neighborhood and a public school in a poor neighborhood. So that inequality needs to be addressed in order to give those kids from a less fortunate background the chance to get an American dream.
Well, the American dream wasn't built on getting things easy. The American dream was built on hard work and putting your nose to the grindstone and actually getting things done. And I think it's absolutely alive and well right now. I think the opportunities are awesome in this country.
You were saying?
Well, I'm just saying, yeah, that man was illustrating what I was saying. Yeah, that that if you are not wealthy, it's your own fault. What is the matter with you? Why haven't you gotten rich? You're not trying hard enough. You're not working hard enough. You are not visualizing success or whatever the fantasy is. Now that whole ideology took a real hit in 2008, 2009, and on. Finally, we woke up to the fact that inequality matters because we're not all going to get rich, no matter how hard we work. And the sad thing is that, some of the hardest working people in this country remain poor no matter how much they work, because they're just not paid enough for it.
Professor West, to what extent is the pressure on government to cut spending? We often hear about the federal deficit, and they're going to cut spending, and social programs are going to be hit very hard. To what extent is that going to exacerbate the problem of poverty in the country?
Well, it's certainly going to increase social misery, and it's going to reinforce the unjust suffering that's out there. But you can see again just how narrow the political discourse is. You have a budget challenge. You don't really look at the military budget. You don't look at the subsidies for corporations, the subsidies for agribusiness. And we know our brothers and sisters in Africa and other parts of the world have to compete with subsidized agribusiness as they deal with their farming, and then say they believe in the free market. You say, oh, sure, sure. No, that's just sheer hypocrisy in that regard. So that when we talk about welfare and socialism for the well-to-do, if we're a banker, we can go get a loan, 0 interest. If you're a working person, 11%, 5%, 7%, 13%. So the imbalance, the asymmetry of rich versus working people and poor people is so overwhelming. But again, this democratic awakening is taking place, and this hypocrisy and mendacity and greed and indifference to poor people is being exposed. And I do think that America is now going to be very much a part of the rest of the world. All this talk about American exceptionalism.
Tavis, you've convened the conference. You've written the book with Professor West. What is the solution, if you could give us that in the short form?
The short form is what we call the 3 Ps. Poverty in this country is not a priority, and it must be. Nothing in Washington goes unaddressed once it gets the label of priority. We have to make poverty a priority in this country. Secondly, there must be a plan. Not a plan just to reduce poverty. A payroll tax cut only works if people are on the payroll. It's a Band-Aid solution. So one, poverty must be a priority. Number two, there must be a plan, not just to reduce it, but to eradicate it. And number three, there must be a path that the American people can be told that we're going to go down, and this ultimately is going to be better for the country. So it's got to be a priority, there's got to be a plan, and there's got to be a path to prosperity.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that's it from the team here in Washington, D.C. for now. But we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. You can send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.